Hello and welcome back to Tanningcote Town. In this episode I just want to look at the history of Peco wonderful wagons. I really quite like these wagons. I think they're great little models, and my love of them started when I was a young lad and my aunt bought me a Kingsbury wagon kit. Having lived near Kingsbury all my life until my early 30s, I thought that this was great, and then not long after that I managed to acquire a Baddesley kit as well, and my nan had moved to Baddesley, so therein started the love affair. Not a lot has happened in Tanningcote Town since your last here. There's a market stall appeared in the middle of the town, but really that's about it. I've been busily researching wonderful wagons and the history of them so I could put this presentation together. The history of wonderful wagons really starts with Railway Modeller issue number 42 from April 1954, when Peco first advertised a component that would become part of the wonderful wagons, the nylon wheel sets. At this time, modellers had a choice of 3 or 2 rail operations, so cleverly manufacturing wheel sets from an insulating material would allow them to be safely used on any 00 gauge layout, which made them universally compatible. Nylon was also still a fairly new material at the time, having only been commercially available for about 20 years, so this is an early example of the level of innovation that we still see from Peco today. And don't forget to tell your friends about the Railway Modeller. The first advertisement I've found for wonderful wagons appears in issue number 43 of Railway Modeller from May 1954. There's an advertisement on page 5 for new lines and a new catalogue by Peco, and the advert covers a number of products and is the first advertisement in Railway Modeller that mentions Peco wonderful wagons. This is an early Peco price list and catalogue from April 1955, and we can see that we've got wagon kits dated in there in section 3. And looking at sections 3 and 4 in the catalogue, we see images of the wonderful wagons, the end and side door types, and also the weathered types that come with a pre-weathered finish. And Peco claim that this is the first time wagons have been pre-weathered by the manufacturer, so another innovation from Peco. Back in Tanningcote Town, we've got an example of each of the models that had side doors and each of the models that had end doors, including the weathered models. The new wonderful wagons at the time did represent a significant advance in 00 gauge railway modelling. The kits were authentic replicas of colourful private owner wagons, and they didn't need painting. They came with working axle box springs, and they came with working buffers as well. Even more innovation from Peco. Peco used to advertise wonderful wagons quite frequently in the Railway Modeller, and not just the manufacturer but model shops as well would quite happily advertise them. They must have been popular because by the time we get to August 1956, Peco decided to add salt wagons to the range. In the September 1956 issue of Railway Modeller, issue number 71, we've got an advert for Peco salt wagons in brilliant colours. This month we see the Saxa Salt model, and also available are Stafford Salt, Manager's Salt and Chance and Hunt. The salt wagons, like the 7-plank coal wagons before them, are all built on a 9-foot underframe chassis, and Peco advertised their salt wagons quite regularly in different issues of Railway Modeller. Peco also went on to release a sifter salt wagon, although this didn't come until April 1957. Meanwhile, back in Tanningcote Town, we've got examples of those first 4 salt wagons, Chance and Hunt, Managers, Saxa and Stafford, along with the sifter salt wagon that didn't appear until a little bit later on. In February 1957, Railway Modeller Volume 8, there's an entry in the trade column on page 48 noting that the wagon kits have proved extremely popular, and at the time of writing very few remain available. It appears that this is a period when the Mark I or Series 1 wonderful wagon kits have ceased to be produced and stock is starting to run out. Mark I salt wagons also have a card roof and not a moulded plastic one that didn't appear until a little bit later on. Peco did advertise the wonderful wagons in Railway Modeller with remarkable consistency, and hardly an issue went past without there being an advertisement present. They also innovated significantly and used that 9-foot wheelbase chassis again to release a range of mineral wagons in 6 varieties. As well as the 5-plank mineral wagons on the 9-foot chassis, we've also got the advertisement telling us that this is when the new sifter salt wagon arrived. It also tells us that there's 23 wagons available now. That's the full range of 5-plank, 7-plank and salt wagons that Peco have now released to the market. So up to this point in the history of Wonderful Wagons, all the models were built on a thin underframe chassis, a 9-foot wheelbase chassis, where you have to stick on the wooden sides and you have to stick on this soul bar transfer as well. There's a lot of information about Peco, the manufacturer, on the base there, and that's how to spot an early 9-foot underframe chassis. The early 7-plank, the early Salt and the early 5-plank wagons all used that same 9-foot wheelbase chassis where you had to stick on the wooden sides and then apply the transfers to the body and the soul bars. When Wonderful Wagons came out in May 54, they were really quite detailed, really advanced compared to the existing models at the time. Look at the 00 model at the top there compared to this Hood and Son. The detail on the Wonderful Wagon is far superior to the other models available at the time. Now, if we have a peer in Peco's 9th edition catalogue from 1957, we can see an image here of the box that the first wagons came in, and this is the box that's roughly 1/3, 2/3 dark blue, light blue. We've got all the features that make the Wonderful Wagons so wonderful, and we've got images of the end and side door coal 7-plank wagons, along with the salt vans and the mineral wagons that have just been released. So at the time, this is the full range of wagons that's available. Back in Tanningcote Town main station, we're just in time to see the range of 5-plank mineral Wonderful Wagons roll through the station. That Beswick's Lime wagon is notable because it was the only lime wagon released by Peco that didn't have a moulded roof. Skipping along the timeline a bit more, we're now in Railway Modeller Volume 9 from December 1958. And on page 4 we've got a full page advertisement for Peco products including Wonderful Wagons and 00 and TT3. The 00 advert tells us that we've got a new 3-plank wagon, and if we shuffle forwards to the correct page where we're given more detail, we can see that on page 11 the new Peco low-sided 3-plank wagons come in 6 varieties on a 10-foot wheelbase chassis. If we look at the advert in detail, it tells us that this is now a complete die-cast body, not the thin chassis that we had with Series 1 models where you added sides that were made from thin ply. It's now a fully die-cast body. This apparently gives the correct weight, but we'll check the scale weight a little bit later on. Now at this point it's worth noting that the Series 1 models have still got until around about 1962 until they become obsolete, but this does mark the point at which Peco seems to change their design philosophy into a fully moulded chassis. The Railway Modeller advert tells us that in December 1958 the first models with the fully moulded die-cast base came out, and these ones that first came out didn't have Peco marked in the chassis like the later models did. By the time BQC British Quarrying Company came out in March 63, and certainly when this one came out, the Field and Mackay low-sided came out in March 1969, it has got Peco marked in the chassis. So a way to tell the very early 3-plank chassis to the later 3-plank chassis is this marking of Peco in the chassis. Incidentally, if you're wondering what the hole is in the bottom of all the chassis, that's the location point for the brake reservoir for the fitted kit that you could also get for these models. Another slight difference between the early and the later models is that there's a shade difference. The earlier model that you can see here has got some darker markings for the strapping and darker grey, where the later model's got a lighter shade of grey. Now we have previously noted that the first series of wagons were on this narrow underframe 9-foot wheelbase chassis where you had to glue on the wooden sides and the templates and the soul bar prints as well. I've found this 10-foot underframe chassis with wooden sides. It's definitely a 10-foot chassis. It's got wooden sides and it's got the narrow thin base, not the one-piece moulded base like the catalogue tells us it should have. And you can see it's a 10-foot wheelbase as well because there's some extra material in here that's not shown on the 9-foot wheelbase to the left. So it is a longer chassis, and I don't know if this is an early development or an early model, but certainly it's not what we were expecting to see according to the catalogue. Meanwhile, back in Tanningcote Town, we've got examples of all of those solid chassis 3-plank wonderful wagons that were initially released. We've got BR fitted and unfitted, Great Western, LMS, North Eastern and Southern region. Now, up to this point, Peco had been releasing wonderful wagons in very defined product groups, the 7-plank, 5-plank and salts. But now we get to February 1962 and railway modelers telling us that Peco have released a new version of the 5-plank wagon. This is now on a moulded single-piece chassis, 9-foot chassis, and it no longer has the Series 1 chassis with the stick-on wooden sides. So this point now starts to mark the end of the Series 1 models and the commencement of the release of Series 2, and Joseph Cole and Son was the first of the new 5-plank wagons to be released. Joseph Cole was the first of the new 5-plank wagons released, and that came out in January 1962. It was followed in June 1962 by the Mendip Mineral 5-plank. The Joseph Cole wagon appears to have been quite short-lived in production, having disappeared by about April 1965. But the Mendip mountain quarries continued in production almost up to the end in the mid-80s, when wonderful wagon production ceased generally. So in 1962 we see the release of the Cliff Hill Granite 7-plank, and the Baddesley 7-plank comes in September along with a download lime. Now the 7-plank is made by using a 5-plank chassis with an extension board, and the lime wagon is made using the 5-plank chassis and a lime roof. It's at this point now that Peco start fitting moulded roofs to lime wagons, and all lime wagons released from this point on do have a moulded roof. There's another new 5-plank wagon, Charles Dunstan, which is released around about February 63, and then in March 63 a 3-plank wagon is added to the range, BQC. March 63 also sees the release of Crawshay Brothers lime with a moulded roof, and in April 63 we get the Kingsbury wagon, the other favourite of mine, the other wagon responsible for my love of and collection of every Peco wonderful wagon ever made. By now we get into October 1963 and Peco advertising is clearly stating that now there are 14 models, an absolute indication that the Series 1 models are discontinued and now it's all moulded chassis Series 2. This advert also tells us that they're introducing the container flat wagon that brings us up to the 14 models. The November 1963 issue of Railway Modeller gives us another advertisement for the new conflat wagons and the 4 private owner container card kits. The containers are Cross and Blackwell, Rally Cycles, IC Fuzi and Lions T. And this marks the introduction of another model, the single plank 10-foot chassis. By now the release of wonderful wagons in the different ranges is quite sporadic and getting a bit bitty, so we're probably better off dealing with the ranges individually. But before we do that, we'll just have a pop over to the 1964 13th edition catalogue. So here we've got Peco's 13th edition catalogue from 1964, and on page 17 we can see all the 9-foot 5-plank mineral wagons that have been released to date, along with the 9-foot lime wagons with moulded plastic roofs. Additionally, we've got the 9-foot 7-plank coal wagons, the 3-plank low-sided 10-foot wheelbase solid chassis wagons, we've got the 4 container card kits, and we've got the container flat wagon, the single plank, again on a 10-foot chassis. So to make the review of all the wonderful wagons ever released a little bit easier, I'll now go through them in wagon design type. So I'll go through the conflats, the 3 planks, 5 planks, 7 planks and so on, and give you an idea of what ran for when and how long. The container kits were embossed printed card sheets that had to be carefully cut out and constructed. What's interesting here is you can see that the sheets are marked with purchase tax and with VAT as well. This helps us to date these prints because purchase tax changed to VAT in the UK on the 1st of April 1973. I have managed to acquire at least one of every container card kit that's been released. Fuzi's for some reason seem to be a little bit hard to find, but here we have Cross and Blackwell, Fuzi, Lions T, Rally Cycles, and the later BR and Silver Cross containers that were released later on. We've got our 1971 catalogue here where all 6 of the containers are shown, including the BR and Silver Cross, which were released in about March 1967. Just coming back to the weight that we were talking about earlier on, the Mark 1s were a lot lighter with their thin ply sides than the Mark 2s, and you can see this Peterborough Co-op wagon's got a tare weight of 6 tonnes 1100 weight there, and if I get a Mark 1 tickle, that's got a load of 10 tonnes marked on the other side. So if we look at a tonne being 2240 pounds and 100 weight being 112 pounds, we can work out our 6 tonnes 1100 weight in pounds and convert that to about 6,669 kilos empty. The load of 10 tonnes in kilos would be about 10,181, so if we add that together we've got 16,850 total. But to get a scale weight of 35.5 grams, we've basically got to take that number of kilos and divide it by 76, then divide it by 76 and divide it by 76 again to give us a scale weight. Weight's a function of volume, so we've got to do it in 3 dimensions. If we do that, we've got a 35.5, we've got a WM Tickle Mark 1 here sitting at 38, so it's already overweight empty. Now, to try and keep the overall weight down, I get this packing foam and paint it black because then it looks like coal. You can paint it different colours, and it's very, very light. Come on, scales. It's very, very light. Once it's been painted up, it's only a couple of grams, so you can put, there you go, 0.7 of a gram. You can put that in the wagon, and it makes it look like it's loaded, but it hasn't added significantly to its overall weight. So even though we had an overweight wagon, even now it's still fairly overweight, but not too bad. Later Mark II wagons, fully die-cast, were over 40 grams, and the vans were approaching 50 grams, so they were overweight really. We'll just have a quick peer in the Peco catalogue to start having a look at the Mark II 5-plank wagons. In 1962, January, Joseph Cole was the first to be released, and after that we saw Mendip Mountain Quarries in June 62. Charles Dunstan appeared in February 63, A. Gresley in March 64, then Tarmac in July 65. Garswood and Logan and Sons were released in March 66, with Derbyshire appearing in July 68. By 1973, Gresley, Garswood and Logan were discontinued. Railway Modeller in March 74 said there was a general refractories model coming, although this appears never to have been produced. March 75 sees the introduction of the Bibbington and the reintroduction of the Dixon model again. Garswood returns in 76 January, and the weathered models for Dixon and Garswood appear in March 79. By the mid-1980s they are all out of production, and only the wagon cars remained available for a number of years after. Next we're going to look at the Mark II onwards 7-plank models with the die-cast chassis. The Mark I models with the earlier chassis were discontinued by 1963, so there was a little overlap with the first of the new Mark II models. Cliffhill came first in January 62, followed by Basley in September of the same year. Kingsbury appeared in April 63, Jenkinson in March 64, Dearne Valley in July 65, Ward and Son appeared in March 66, Emlyn and Moseley both came in March 69. By early 73, Dearne Valley, Badsley and Kingsbury had been discontinued, but the latter two did make a comeback soon after, thankfully. March 74 saw the introduction of Pinkston. March 75 saw New Battle introduced, with Hood and Son not following until August 77, which is when we start to see the Magni Simplex couplings of the Mark III models. The weathered models followed after, with Emlyn and Moseley appearing in March 79 and Anderson weathered appearing in January 81. I'm guessing that's when the Royal Wedding commemorative model also appeared. Again, by the mid-80s production had ceased and only the wagon cars were available for a time thereafter. I'm going to look at the Lime Wagon timeline in a minute, but before I do that I'm going to jump forwards in the Wonderful Wagon timeline a bit to this oddity. It's the Leaf General Warehousing model that was available from March 75 until production discontinued in the mid-80s. If you take a 5-plank chassis, the salt van extension moulding and the salt wagon roof, then add the appropriate wagon card, you get the only wagon of this type that's not a salt wagon. The line wagons were all built on a 5-plank chassis with the line wagon roof and the appropriate wagon cars trimmed and affixed to suit. Downlow came first in September 62, Crochet in March 63, South Wales Lime followed a bit later in March 66. SLB Lime didn't appear until January 71, by which time South Wales had disappeared only to reappear in January 76. The weathered Downlow appeared in January 81 and they were all discontinued by the mid-80s. Now, having just mentioned that Leaf was the only salt wagon that was not a salt wagon because it wasn't badged as a salt wagon even though it was built like a salt wagon, we might as well look at the salt wagons. Earlier we saw the Mark 1 salts and they were built on a Mark 1 chassis with wooden sides and a card roof. They had transfers for the body and also a transfer for the sole bar as well, so they're easily distinguished from the Mark 2 onwards. The Mark 1s were discontinued by early 1963, so there was a slight overlap with the new ones that followed. The more modern salts were built on a Mark II 5-plank chassis with a moulded extension and a moulded roof. August 62 saw Saxo Salt and Stafford Salt appear together, and in July 68 ICI and Union Salt were added. Shaker Salt followed in January 71 and finally the Weathered Shaker in January 81. By the mid-80s again they were all out of production, and that made the Weathered Shaker one of the few models with a short life. The box vans are next in the timeline, having been introduced for the summer of 1966. Peco must have thought they'd kicked an own goal with these because they are a great representation of colourful private owner wagons. Coleman's Mustard and his old products came first in around August 66 and they added a splash of bright, vibrant colour to your layout. March 67 saw the arrival of 5 Spananas and July 68 saw the introduction of the Bass and Worthington vans. Blue Circle Cement was next in March 69, then January 71 saw the introduction of the Carrick's van. Shortly after, Coleman seems to have been discontinued but made a comeback after the arrival of the J&W Stewart box van in March 75. The weathered Blue Circle van appeared in January 81 and they were all out of production by the mid-80s, again the weathered model having a particularly short production life. Finally, we've got the Peco Wonderful tank wagons. March 68 saw the arrival of the first 2 tank wagons, Esso with a silvery grey body and Shell with the plain grey body. These models were on a completely new chassis and were fitted with the Anita tension lock couplers as standard. In July 68 the third model in the range is added, and that's the BP tanker in white. These ran until the end of production in the mid-80s. There were some Mark IV tankers that went on to become Parkside models, and they're still available in some similar guise today. These were released in about April 1986 as United Dairies, Shell BP and Royal Daylight. The National Benzol wagon was also shown in the 1985 catalogue supplement as being introduced, but it was never made. Instead, the Express Dairy tanker appeared in February 1988. These latter 4 tankers are still to be seen in the 1994 catalogue after all the other wonderful wagons stopped appearing in the mid to late 80s. And it appears they got absorbed into Parkside range sometime after that, as no wonderful wagons appear in catalogues from 1995 onwards. Peco also offered accessories to wonderful wagons, including in the January 1979 catalogue the addition of Coke boards. So Greasley's, Mosley's and I think WM Tickle were the only wagons that had Coke noted on the side, so here's a few examples. I'll run a few rakes of wagons now so that you can see all the models that were ever produced, one by one. They'll all stream past and you'll get to see at least one of the 89 models of wonderful wagon that Peco released, and the 6 containers that were also released. Now don't forget that if you start counting these, don't count the conflax 6 times, just count them once. You should come up with about 89 for all the models that were ever released. And just in case that you were interested, my collection of wonderful wagons, I've actually got about 288 wagons in total, in various states of repair and restoration. I suppose now as well, it's also time I answered the burning question: what made me collect all of them? Well, I was originally buying used models and wagon cards from various model shops so that I could create rakes of Baddesley, Kingsbury and other models that of wagons that would have been seen in the area where I lived and grew up for the time period of my layout. I brought quite a lot, I have to say, and one day one of my mates saw how many I'd got in a box and said, "Jeez mate, you must have at least one of everyone they ever made in there." So blame him, it's his fault. I actually thought to myself, oh, that's a good question, I wonder if I have. So I started doing the research, put everything together. I've got loads of information that hasn't appeared in this video, there's just too much information. I've got spreadsheets, Word documents, copies of advertisements, all sorts of things, so that I could work out exactly what got released and when, and what all the models were. Then I went and found the ones that were missing, and some of them are very hard to find now, especially the ones from the early 50s, the Series 1 three-plank wagons. They're very difficult to find, particularly the BR models. And some of the weathered models are also hard to find because they had such short production life. But anyway, there it is, that's the story of Peco Wonderful Wagons and why I decided that maybe I should try and own at least one of all of them. So this for me has been an interesting little rainy day project, and that's probably why it's taken me so long to put this together, and probably why it's taken such a long time for me to put out another video from Tanningcote Town. I have enjoyed doing this, I must say, and I have achieved the goal of putting together some decent sized rakes of Kingsley, Baddesley, Cliffhill granite and other wagons that came from the area where I grew up. I'll show you some of those now to finish off the video and leave with a final view across the new marketplace in Tanningcote Town as we look at the last loads of wonderful wagons trundling through the town station.